Hi, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm good, my son. What about you, and how is your study going?
I'm absolutely fine, sir. Today I wanted to discuss Christopher Columbus and his impact on history.
That's a great topic. Columbus is a fascinating figure in history. What specifically would you like to discuss about him?
I am interested in his exploration of the Americas and how it affected the indigenous populations there. I've read conflicting accounts, and I'd like to understand more about what really happened.
That's a complex and important aspect of Columbus's legacy. While his voyages to the Americas were historically significant, they also had profound and often tragic consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the Americas. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of European colonization, which led to the displacement, enslavement, and extermination of millions of indigenous people. Christopher Columbus, born on the 25th of August, 1451, and died on the 20th of May, 1506. He was an Italian explorer and navigator from the Republic of Genoa, who completed 4 Spanish-based voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, sponsored by the Catholic monarchs, opening the way for the widespread European exploration and European colonization of the America. His expeditions were the first known European contact with the Caribbean and Central and South America.
Yes, I've read about the diseases brought by Europeans that decimated indigenous populations, as well as the violent conflicts and forced labor that followed. But I've also heard some argue that Columbus himself didn't intend for these things to happen, and that he was more of a product of his time. Is there truth to that?
It's true that Columbus was a product of the 15th century, a time when the prevailing attitudes towards exploration, conquest, and colonization were very different from today. However, it's also important to recognize that Columbus's actions and decisions had direct and devastating impacts on the indigenous peoples he encountered. While his motivations may have been driven by a desire for wealth, fame, and imperial expansion, the consequences of his actions cannot be ignored or justified by the standards of his time.
That makes sense. It's important to consider historical figures within the context of their time, but also to critically examine their actions and the impacts they had. Thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome. It's always valuable to critically examine history and its impact on different peoples and cultures. Understanding the complexities of figures like Columbus helps us to learn from the past and navigate the present with greater awareness and empathy.
And sir, also, I wanted to delve deeper into the life and legacy of Christopher Columbus. There's so much debate surrounding his actions and their impact, and I'm eager to explore this topic further.
I'm glad you're interested in this topic. Christopher Columbus is indeed a figure whose legacy is both complex and controversial. What specific aspects of his life and actions would you like to discuss?
I'd like to start with his motivations for exploration. Some argue that Columbus was primarily driven by a thirst for wealth and glory, while others suggest that he was also motivated by a genuine desire to spread Christianity. What do historical records indicate about his motivations?
Columbus's motivations were likely multifaceted. While he was certainly driven by a desire for wealth and glory, as were many explorers of his time, there is evidence to suggest that he was also influenced by religious fervor. Columbus was deeply religious and believed that his voyages had a divine purpose, namely to spread Christianity to new lands and to convert indigenous peoples.
That's interesting. It seems that Columbus's motivations were intertwined with the broader context of religious and imperial expansion in Europe at the time. How did his voyages impact the indigenous populations of the Americas?
Columbus's voyages had a profound and often devastating impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The arrival of Europeans brought with it diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. These diseases spread rapidly and decimated entire communities, leading to widespread death and suffering.
That's tragic. I've also read about the violence and exploitation that followed Columbus's arrival, including forced labor and the encomienda system. How did these practices contribute to the decline of indigenous populations?
The encomienda system, which allowed Spanish colonists to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities, was particularly harmful. Indigenous peoples were forced to work in mines and on plantations under brutal conditions, leading to further depopulation and suffering. Additionally, violent conflicts between Europeans and indigenous peoples resulted in widespread death and displacement.
It's clear that Columbus's actions had far-reaching and devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. How should we remember and reckon with this legacy today?
Remembering Columbus's legacy requires us to confront the dark chapters of history and to acknowledge the suffering and injustice inflicted upon indigenous peoples. It also reminds us of the importance of critically examining historical narratives and questioning the motives and actions of historical figures. By doing so, we can strive to learn from the past and work towards a more just and equitable future.
Thank you for the insightful discussion, teacher. I now have a deeper understanding of Christopher Columbus and his impact on history.